The envelope sitting on my kitchen counter looked official enough to make my stomach turn, but I had no idea it was about to upend my entire life in ways I never could have imagined. I am Brandon Pierce, and I have lived on my 5-acre property outside Asheville, North Carolina for the past decade. My house sits at the end of a winding dirt road, surrounded by trees and mountain views that make every morning coffee feel like a small miracle. I bought this land back in 2015 with money I had saved from years of working construction, and it was supposed to be my retirement haven, the place where I could finally breathe after spending most of my adult life in cramped city apartments. The letter was from something called the Meadowbrook Hills Homeowners Association, and the first line hit me like a brick. This is your final notice regarding 10 years of unpaid homeowner association dues totaling $37,500. Failure to remit payment within 30 days will result in foreclosure proceedings on your property located at 1847 Mountain Laurel Road. I read it 3 times before the words actually sank in. Homeowners Association? I had never joined any HOA. When I bought this property, it was a private sale from an elderly farmer named Curtis Johnson who wanted to downsize. There had been no mention of any HOA, no documents about community rules, nothing. Just a straightforward land purchase with a clear title. I pulled out my property documents from the fireproof safe in my office. Everything looked exactly as it had 10 years ago. My deed was clean, the survey showed my boundaries clearly, and nowhere in any of the paperwork was there a single mention of Meadowbrook Hills or any homeowners association. I had bought raw land with an old farmhouse that I had spent years renovating with my own 2 hands. The next morning I drove into the development called Meadowbrook Hills for the first time in my life. It was one of those cookie-cutter subdivisions that had sprouted up in the late 2000s, all beige vinyl siding and manicured lawns with strict rules about mailbox colors. The houses were packed together like sardines, each one barely distinguishable from its neighbor. It was exactly the kind of place I had bought my property to avoid. The HOA office was located in a small building near the subdivision entrance, wedged between a community pool and a playground. Inside, a middle-aged woman with severe bangs and a pearl necklace sat behind a desk, typing furiously on a computer. Her nameplate read, "Deborah Whitmore, HOA President. Can I help you?" she asked without looking up. "I am Brandon Pierce. I received a letter from your organization demanding 10 years of back dues." That got her attention. She looked up and I could see the predatory gleam in her eyes immediately. This was someone who lived for conflict. "Mr. Pierce, we have been trying to reach you for years. Your property falls within our jurisdiction, and you have been in violation of our payment requirements since 2015. "That is impossible," I said, keeping my voice steady. "My property is not part of any HOA. I bought it directly from Curtis Johnson, and there was never any mention of your association." Deborah stood up and walked to a filing cabinet, pulling out a thick folder. When Meadowbrook Hills was established in 2008, the developer, Pinnacle Properties, included specific boundary language in our covenants. Your property at 1847 Mountain Laurel Road falls within those boundaries. Show me. She spread a map across her desk. It showed the Meadowbrook Hills subdivision with its neat rows of houses, and someone had drawn a red line extending beyond the subdivision proper to include several additional parcels, including what appeared to be my property. "This is your map," I said, "not a legal survey. My deed and survey show clearly that my land is separate from your development." "Our attorney disagrees," Deborah said primly. "And unless you pay the outstanding dues plus late fees and interest, we will proceed with foreclosure. You have 30 days. I left the office feeling like I had just been mugged. This woman was trying to claim ownership over my property based on some map that her HOA had drawn up. It was insane. But the letter had been real, and the threat of foreclosure was something I could not ignore. My first call was to a real estate attorney named Marcus Chen, who had an office in downtown Asheville. I had met him a few years back at a community meeting about zoning issues, and he had struck me as sharp and no nonsense. When I explained the situation, he asked me to come in immediately. Marcus listened to everything, examined my documents, and then pulled up county records on his computer. "Your deed is absolutely clear," he said after 20 minutes of research. "There is no A covenant attached to your property. The previous owner, Curtis Johnson, owned this land free and clear since 1967, long before Meadowbrook Hills even existed. When Pinnacle Properties developed that subdivision, they had no legal right to include your parcel in their HOA boundaries. So what do I do? First, I will send them a cease and desist letter making it clear that you are not a member of their HOA and that any attempt to foreclose will be met with legal action. Second, we need to find out who is behind this and why they think they can make this claim." The cease and desist letter went out that afternoon. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. 3 days later, I came home to find a notice stapled to my front door. It was a violation citation from Meadowbrook Hills HOA, claiming that my property was in violation of community standards. The list was absurd. My grass was too long, I had an unauthorized vehicle parked in my driveway, my house color was not approved, and I had failed to submit architectural plans for my deck renovation from 2017. I called Marcus immediately. They are escalating. This is harassment. Document everything, he said. Take photos, keep every piece of paper they send you. We are building a case for harassment and attempted fraud. The next week, things got worse. I received a certified letter informing me that the HOA had placed a lien on my property for unpaid dues. When I checked with the county recorder's office, I discovered that Deborah Whitmore had indeed filed a lien, claiming $3,750 in unpaid assessments. This is fraud, Marcus said when I showed him the documentation. She has filed a false lien against property that is not part of her HOA. That is a criminal act in North Carolina. We filed an emergency motion to have the lien removed and sued the Meadowbrook Hills HOA for slander of title, harassment, and attempted fraud. The hearing was set for 6 weeks out, which felt like an eternity. During those 6 weeks, my life became a nightmare. Deborah Whitmore seemed to have made it her personal mission to destroy me. I received violation notices almost daily. She sent people to photograph my property from the road. She even showed up at my house one Saturday morning with 2 other HOA board members, demanding to inspect my property for violations. Get off my land, I told them from my porch. You have no authority here. We have every right to ensure compliance with community standards, Deborah said, her voice dripping with self-righteousness. Your property is an eyesore and brings down everyone's property values. My property is not part of your community. You are trespassing. Leave now, or I will call the sheriff. One of the other board members, a man in his 50s wearing khakis and a polo shirt with the Meadowbrook Hills logo, stepped forward. You cannot just ignore your responsibilities. Every homeowner has to pay their fair share. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. Yes, I need a deputy at 1847 Mountain Laurel Road. There are trespassers on my property who refuse to leave. That got them moving. Deborah shot me a look of pure hatred before stalking back to her car. This is not over, she called out. You will pay what you owe. The sheriff's deputy arrived 15 minutes later. I explained the situation, showed him the demand letters and violation notices. He took notes and told me to keep documenting everything. Sounds like they are running some kind of scam, he said. We have seen this before with aggressive HOAs. They try to expand their territory to collect more dues, usually backs off once lawyers get involved. I hoped he was right, but I had a sinking feeling Deborah Whitmore was not the type to back off from anything. The preliminary hearing finally arrived in late June. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, and Judge Patricia Hendricks had a reputation for being fair but tough. Marcus had prepared me well, organizing all my documents into neat binders with tabs and summaries. The HOA was represented by an attorney named Gerald Fisk, a man in his 60s with an expensive suit and a condescending manner. He opened by arguing that the HOA's boundaries had been clearly established in 2008 and that my property fell within those boundaries regardless of what my deed said. Judge Hendricks stopped him mid-sentence. Are you arguing that an HOA created in 2008 can retroactively include property that was privately owned since 1967? Your Honor, the developer's master plan included all contiguous properties within a specific geographic area. Did the developer own Mr. Pierce's property in 2008? Fisk hesitated. No, Your Honor, but the covenants were written to include the entire area. Mr. Chen, what does your client's deed say? Marcus stood up. Your Honor, Mr. Pierce's property has a clear chain of title going back more than 50 years. There is no HOA covenant attached to the deed, no mention of Meadowbrook Hills in any of the sale documents, and the previous owner never signed any agreement with the HOA. Furthermore, we have survey documentation showing that Mr. Pierce's property is geographically separate from the Meadowbrook Hills subdivision. The judge reviewed the documents we had submitted. The courtroom was silent except for the sound of pages turning. After what felt like an hour but was probably only 10 minutes, Judge Hendricks looked up. The lien is ordered removed immediately. Mr. Fisk, your client had no legal basis to file this lien, and I am concerned about what appears to be attempted fraud. Mr. Chen, you mentioned harassment in your filing? Marcus proceeded to detail every violation notice, every threatening letter, and every incident of Deborah Whitmore and her board members showing up at my property. He had photographs, copies of all the notices, and even a timeline showing the escalating pattern of harassment. Judge Hendricks did not look happy. Ms. Whitmore, please stand up. Deborah had been sitting in the front row of the gallery. She stood up slowly, and for the first time I saw uncertainty in her face. Did you personally approve these violation notices against Mr. Pierce? Your Honor, I was acting in my capacity as HOA president to enforce our community standards that do not apply to Mr. Pierce because he is not part of your community. Did you verify that his property was legally part of your HOA before filing the lien and sending violation notices? Our attorney advised us that the property was included in our boundaries. Judge Hendricks turned to Gerald Fisk. Did you advise your client to file this lien? Fisk looked uncomfortable. Your Honor, I advised the board based on the documentation they provided to me. I was not aware of the complete history of the property. So you filed a lien without doing a proper title search? The silence that followed was damning. Judge Hendricks ordered the lien removed immediately and issued a temporary restraining order preventing the Meadowbrook Hills HOA from any further contact with me or my property. She also ordered both parties to return for a full hearing on damages in 30 days. Walking out of that courthouse, I felt like I could breathe for the first time in weeks. But Marcus cautioned me that this was just the beginning. Deborah Whitmore does not strike me as someone who accepts defeat gracefully, he said. Keep your guard up. He was right to warn me. 2 weeks after the hearing, I discovered that someone had filed a complaint with the county zoning department, claiming I was operating an illegal business on my property. The complaint alleged I was running an unlicensed mechanic shop because I had an old pickup truck in my driveway that I was restoring as a hobby. The zoning inspector who came out was apologetic. I can see this is just a personal vehicle, he said, looking at the 1972 Chevrolet C10 that I had been slowly fixing up for the past 2 years. Someone is wasting county resources with frivolous complaints. Can you tell me who filed the complaint? I am not supposed to, but given the circumstances, it came from a Deborah Whitmore. I documented that too. Marcus added it to our growing file. The pattern continued. Someone called the health department claiming I had a septic system failure. Another inspection, another false complaint. Someone reported me to the fire marshal for having excessive combustible materials on my property because I had a woodpile for my fireplace. Every single complaint came back unfounded, and every single one could be traced back to either Deborah Whitmore or other Meadowbrook Hills board members. This is stalking and harassment, Marcus said. At the full hearing, we are going to ask for significant damages. But before we could get to that hearing, things took a darker turn. I woke up one morning in mid-July to find that someone had spray-painted "Pay Your Dues" across my garage door in bright red letters. I called the sheriff's office immediately, and this time they sent a detective. Detective Sarah Martinez was in her 40s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense attitude. She photographed the graffiti, took my statement, and reviewed all the documentation I had been keeping about the HOA harassment. This has escalated to vandalism and possibly stalking, she said. Do you have security cameras? No, I never needed them before. Get some. If they come back, we need footage. I spent that afternoon installing a Ring doorbell and 2 outdoor security cameras covering my driveway and front yard. The cameras had motion detection and night vision, and everything uploaded to the cloud automatically. 3 nights later, at 2 in the morning, my phone buzzed with an alert. Someone was on my property. I pulled up the camera feed and saw a figure in dark clothing walking up my driveway. They were carrying something, but I could not make out what it was in the darkness. I called 911 while watching the feed. The figure approached my truck and appeared to be doing something near the tires. Then they moved toward my house. The camera caught a clear shot of their face in the motion-activated floodlight I had installed. It was Deborah Whitmore. She was holding a hammer and she was walking toward my front door. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept by my bed and went downstairs, making sure to stay behind the locked door. The police are on their way, I shouted through the door. I have you on camera. Leave now. I heard footsteps running, an engine starting and tires squealing. 5 minutes later, 2 sheriff's deputies arrived. I showed them the footage, and they immediately recognized Deborah. That is Deborah Whitmore, Deputy Chen said. We have had complaints about her before, HOA disputes mostly, but nothing like this. Detective Martinez arrived 20 minutes later. She reviewed the footage and examined my truck, discovering that all 4 tires had been slashed. Damage was documented, and she took the memory card from my security system as evidence. We are going to arrest her, Martinez said. This is vandalism, trespassing, and potentially attempted breaking and entering. Combined with the pattern of harassment, the DA is going to want to prosecute. Watching the police arrest Deborah Whitmore the next morning was surreal. She came to the door in a bathrobe, and when they told her she was under arrest, she actually tried to argue that she had every right to be on my property because I was an HOA member. Madam, you are under arrest for criminal trespassing, vandalism, and destruction of property, Martinez said. You have the right to remain silent. The arrest made the local news. HOA president arrested for harassment campaign read the headline in the Asheville Citizen-Times. The story detailed the false lien, the violation notices, and finally the vandalism captured on camera. Within days, it had gone viral on social media, with people sharing their own HOA horror stories in the comments. The publicity had an immediate effect. 3 other property owners contacted Marcus Chen's office. saying they had received similar demands from Meadowbrook Hills HOA for properties that were not actually part of the subdivision. It turned out Deborah and her board had been running this scam for years, targeting rural properties adjacent to their development and trying to force them to pay dues or face foreclosure. The full hearing was rescheduled to include these new plaintiffs. What had started as my individual case was now a class action lawsuit against Meadowbrook Hills HOA, Deborah Whitmore personally, and the law firm that had advised them. The hearing in August was packed. Judge Hendricks listened to testimony from all 4 property owners who had been targeted. One woman, an elderly widow named Margaret Foster, broke down crying as she described how Deborah had threatened to take her home if she did not pay $45,000 in back dues for a property her late husband had owned since the 1950s. Gerald Fisk tried to argue that his firm had relied on information provided by the HOA board, but Judge Hendricks was not sympathetic. "You are an attorney," she said coldly. "You have a responsibility to verify the information your clients provide before filing legal documents. These liens were fraudulent, and you had a duty to discover that before filing them with the county." The judge ruled in favor of all 4 plaintiffs, ordering the HOA to pay actual damages, punitive damages, and attorney fees. My award alone was $275,000, which more than covered the new tires, the security system, the legal fees, and compensation for months of harassment and stress. Margaret Foster received even more because she had actually paid the HOA $15,000 before realizing she had been scammed, but the legal victory was just the beginning of the fallout. The criminal charges against Deborah Whitmore moved forward rapidly. The district attorney assigned to the case, a sharp woman named Linda Park, was determined to make an example out of what she called HOA overreach and fraud. The criminal trial began in October. I had to testify about everything that had happened, from the first demand letter to the night I caught Deborah on camera slashing my tires. The courtroom was packed with residents from Meadowbrook Hills, many of whom seemed shocked to learn what their HOA president had been doing. The most damaging testimony came from a former board member named Richard Santos who had resigned earlier in the year. He testified that Deborah had presented the board with fraudulent survey maps, claiming that multiple properties outside the subdivision were actually part of their jurisdiction. When Richard had questioned the accuracy of the maps, Deborah had pushed him out of his position. "She said we needed to expand our revenue base," Richard testified. "She wanted to increase the HOA's funds so she could pay for more amenities and upgrades. I told her we could not just claim property that was not ours, but she insisted the developer's original master plan gave us the authority." The prosecution also presented evidence that Deborah had personally profited from the scheme. As HOA president, she had been voting herself bonuses and expense reimbursements that far exceeded what was reasonable. Over the past 5 years, she had paid herself more than $150,000 from HOA funds, much of it coming from the illegal dues she had collected from property owners like Margaret Foster. The defense tried to argue that Deborah had genuinely believed she had the authority to expand the HOA boundaries, but the video footage of her slashing my tires and approaching my house with a hammer undermined any claim that she was simply making an honest mistake. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. They found Deborah Whitmore guilty on multiple counts: fraud, filing false liens, stalking, vandalism, trespassing, and attempted extortion. Judge Hendricks scheduled sentencing for December. In the meantime, the Meadowbrook Hills HOA was in chaos. The remaining board members had resigned en masse, and the homeowners had called an emergency meeting to dissolve the entire organization. Many residents were furious to learn that their dues had been used to fund Deborah's harassment campaigns and illegal bonuses rather than maintaining the community pool and common areas. The homeowners voted to hire a management company to take over the HOA's legitimate functions while they worked to rebuild trust and establish proper oversight. They also voted to send formal apology letters to everyone who had been targeted by Deborah's schemes, including me. I received that apology letter in November. It was signed by a new interim board president named Thomas Wright, and it was refreshingly straightforward. He acknowledged that the previous leadership had engaged in illegal and unethical behavior, apologized for the harm caused, and promised that the new board would operate with transparency and within proper legal boundaries. I appreciated the gesture, but the damage had been done. I would never forget the months of harassment, the stress of wondering if I might actually lose my home, or the violation of having someone vandalize my property in the middle of the night. Deborah Whitmore's sentencing hearing in December was standing room only. Several of her victims gave impact statements, including me. I kept mine brief. "I bought my property to have peace and privacy," I said. "Deborah Whitmore tried to steal that from me through fraud and intimidation. When that did not work, she came to my home in the middle of the night to vandalize my property and terrorize me. She needs to be held accountable not just for what she did to me, but for all the people she victimized over the years. Judge Hendricks sentenced Deborah to 3 years in state prison, followed by 5 years of probation. She was also ordered to pay full restitution to all her victims, which totaled more than $200,000. Additionally, she was permanently banned from serving on any HOA board or in any position of authority over a homeowners association. As the bailiffs led Deborah out of the courtroom in handcuffs, she turned and looked directly at me. There was no remorse in her eyes, only anger. Even after everything, she still believed she had been in the right. The civil lawsuit against Gerald Fisk's law firm was settled out of court in January 2026. The firm agreed to pay an additional $500,000 to be divided among the 4 plaintiffs, and Gerald Fisk himself was formally reprimanded by the North Carolina State Bar for failing to conduct adequate due diligence before filing the fraudulent liens. By February, nearly a year after that first demand letter had arrived, my life was finally returning to normal. The security cameras stayed up, and I had become more cautious about protecting my property and privacy, but the constant fear and stress were gone. I used some of the settlement money to finish renovations on my house that I had been putting off. The new roof I had been needing for years got installed in March. I built a proper workshop for my truck restoration hobby, and I paid off the remainder of my mortgage, meaning I truly owned my land free and clear, with no debt and no claims against it. On a warm morning in April, almost exactly a year after Deborah Whitmore had first tried to claim my property, I sat on my front porch with my coffee and looked out at the mountain views that had drawn me to this place. My truck restoration was nearly complete, gleaming in the driveway. The trees were budding with spring growth. Everything was quiet except for birds and the occasional distant sound of traffic. Marcus Chen called that afternoon with final news. The Meadowbrook Hills HOA has officially updated their covenant boundaries to exclude all properties outside the original subdivision, he said. They have also implemented new oversight procedures requiring independent legal review before any liens can be filed. And they have established a victim compensation fund to pay back anyone who might have paid dues to the HOA without realizing they were not actually members. Good, I said. Maybe something positive came out of this mess after all. You did the right thing by fighting back, Marcus said. A lot of people would have just paid to make the problem go away. You stood your ground and you stopped them from doing this to other people. After we hung up, I thought about that. He was right. If I had simply paid the $3,700 they demanded, or if I had sold my property and moved away, Deborah would still be out there targeting vulnerable property owners. Margaret Foster might have lost her home. Other people would have been victimized. The whole experience had taught me something important about standing up to bullies, even when they hide behind official-sounding organizations and legal threats. The Meadowbrook Hills HOA had seemed powerful and intimidating with their demand letters, violation notices, and threats of foreclosure. But when challenged with facts and proper legal documentation, their entire scheme had collapsed. I also learned to trust my instincts. When that first letter arrived demanding 10 years of dues for an HOA I had never joined, my gut told me something was wrong. It would have been easy to second-guess myself, to wonder if maybe I had somehow missed signing something, or if there was some loophole that made their claims legitimate. But I had trusted my own knowledge of my property purchase and fought back accordingly. In May, I received an unexpected visitor. Thomas Wright, the interim president of the Meadowbrook Hills HOA, drove out to my property and asked if he could speak with me. I invited him to sit on the porch, though I remained wary. I wanted to thank you personally, Thomas said. What you did, exposing Deborah's fraud, it saved our community. We were hemorrhaging money to pay for her schemes and bonuses. Our reserve funds were nearly depleted. If this had gone on another year, the entire HOA would have been bankrupt. I was just protecting my own property, I said. Maybe, but the effect was much bigger than that. We have completely restructured how the HOA operates. We hired a professional management company. We have independent auditors reviewing our finances quarterly, and we have term limits on all board positions now. No one will ever be able to do what Deborah did again. I nodded. That sounds like positive change. Some of the residents wanted me to ask if you would consider joining our community advisory board. Obviously, your property is not part of the HOA, but we value your perspective and your willingness to stand up for what is right. I thought about it for a moment, then shook my head. I appreciate the offer, but I bought this property specifically to avoid HOA life. No offense to your community, but I like living out here on my own terms. Thomas smiled. I understand completely. The offer stands if you ever change your mind. After he left, I realized that this was the closure I needed. The Meadowbrook Hills HOA was not my enemy anymore. It was just a community trying to fix its problems and move forward. Deborah Whitmore had been the problem, and she was now in prison paying for her crimes. Summer arrived with warm weather and long evenings. I finally finished the truck restoration in June and took it to a classic car show in downtown Asheville where it won third place in its category. Standing next to that truck, talking with other enthusiasts who appreciated the work that went into restoring a 40-year-old vehicle, I felt a satisfaction that had nothing to do with lawsuits or HOA disputes. This was what I had wanted when I bought this property. Time to work on projects I cared about. Peace and quiet. The freedom to live my life without someone sending me violation notices about my grass length or my choice of house colors. In July, I got a letter from the North Carolina Real Estate Commission. They had opened an investigation into Pinnacle Properties, the developer that had originally created Meadowbrook Hills, based on evidence that came out during Deborah's trial. Apparently, the covenant language that Deborah had used to justify claiming outside properties had been intentionally vague, possibly to allow for future expansion attempts. The developer had sold the rights to those covenants to the HOA when the last house in the subdivision sold, effectively washing their hands of any liability. The commission was reviewing whether Pinnacle Properties had engaged in fraud by creating covenants that claimed authority over properties the developer did not own. It was a slow-moving investigation, but it represented another layer of accountability for the people who had enabled Deborah's schemes. By August, I had settled into a comfortable routine. My property was secure, my legal battles were finished, and I could finally focus on the things I had moved out here to do. I started a large garden, growing vegetables and herbs that I could not have maintained while dealing with constant harassment. I built a fire pit in the backyard and started inviting friends over for evening gatherings. One of those friends, a woman named Grace Wellington, who worked as a paralegal in Marcus Chen's office, became a regular visitor. We had met during the legal proceedings, and she had been impressed by how I handled the pressure of the lawsuit and criminal trial. What started as casual friendship evolved into something more as the summer progressed. Grace had her own HOA horror stories from her previous apartment complex, where the board had tried to ban pets despite the lease agreements clearly allowing them. She appreciated my 5 acres of freedom as much as I did, and she understood why I had fought so hard to protect it. By September, Grace had moved in. We talked about getting married eventually, but there was no rush. We were both enjoying the peace and simplicity of life on the property, far from HOA regulations and neighborhood drama. I did keep tabs on Deborah Whitmore's situation through public records. She was serving her sentence at the North Carolina Correctional Institution for Women in Raleigh. According to the prison system's website, her earliest possible release date was 2028, assuming good behavior. Given her complete lack of remorse at sentencing, I suspected she would serve the full 3 years. The Meadowbrook Hills HOA continued to thrive under its new management structure. Thomas Wright and his board focused on actual community improvements rather than expansion schemes. They repaired the pool, upgraded the playground equipment, and started a neighborhood watch program that focused on real safety concerns rather than harassing residents over minor violation notices. Several of the homeowners who had lived through the Deborah Whitmore era contacted me to share their own stories of what they had endured. One man told me about being fined $500 because his mailbox was the wrong shade of black. Another woman described getting violation notices for having garden gnomes in her yard, which Deborah had deemed aesthetically inappropriate. The stories reinforced my conviction that I had made the right choice in buying property outside any HOA jurisdiction. In October, I received a notice that Pinnacle Properties had settled with the North Carolina Real Estate Commission, paying a fine of $250,000 and agreeing to have their development licenses restricted for 5 years. They were also required to send corrective documentation to every HOA they had established, clarifying the actual legal boundaries and removing any ambiguous language that could be used to claim authority over non-member properties. It was not enough to put them out of business, but it would prevent them from creating more situations like mine. The Commission also used the case to establish new regulations for HOA covenant language, requiring clear legal descriptions and prohibiting any claims over properties not owned by the developer or explicitly included through voluntary membership. December brought snow to the mountains, and my property looked like a winter postcard. Grace and I spent a quiet Christmas together, hosting a small gathering of friends including Marcus Chen and his family. It was the opposite of the previous December, when I had been preparing for Deborah's sentencing hearing and dealing with the stress of ongoing legal proceedings. As 2027 began, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened. 2 years earlier, I had been living peacefully on my property, with no idea that someone was planning to claim it through fraud and intimidation. The fight to protect my home had been exhausting and frightening, but it had also revealed strengths I had not known I possessed. I had learned to stand up for myself against people who relied on intimidation and official-sounding threats. I had learned that documentation and evidence were more powerful than bluster and aggression. And I had learned that there were good people, lawyers like Marcus and cops like Detective Martinez, who would help when someone was being victimized by scams and harassment. Grace and I got married in April 2027 in a small ceremony on the property, surrounded by friends and the mountain views that had drawn me here in the first place. We did not send invitations to anyone from Meadowbrook Hills, though Thomas Wright sent a congratulatory card when he heard the news through mutual acquaintances. The property that had almost been stolen from me through HOA fraud was now the foundation of a new life. We talked about building a workshop for Grace, who had discovered a passion for woodworking. We planned to expand the garden and maybe get some chickens. All the things that would have been impossible in an HOA-controlled subdivision. In June, I got an unexpected call from a journalist at the Charlotte Observer. She was writing a feature story about HOA overreach and abuse in North Carolina, inspired in part by my case against Meadowbrook Hills. She wanted to interview me about my experience and what I had learned. I agreed to the interview, and the resulting article, published in July 2027, sparked a broader conversation about HOA reform. State legislators began discussing new laws to prevent the kind of fraud Deborah Whitmore had perpetrated. There was talk of requiring HOAs to carry insurance against fraudulent chants by board members, establishing a state oversight board to investigate complaints, and creating a streamlined process for property owners to challenge improper liens. None of those reforms would help me at this point, but they might prevent other people from going through what I had experienced. That felt important. By August 2027, more than 2 years after that first demand letter had arrived, I could honestly say that life was better than ever. My property was secure, my marriage was happy, and I had turned my truck restoration hobby into a small side business helping other people restore classic vehicles. The workshop I had built after the settlement was now generating income while allowing me to work with my hands on projects I genuinely enjoyed. Grace's legal experience proved invaluable for the business side of the restoration work. She helped me draft clear contracts, understand liability issues, and navigate the bureaucracy of business licensing and taxes. We made a good team, both personally and professionally. The one shadow that remained was knowing Deborah Whitmore would eventually be released from prison. Detective Martinez had helped me set up a victim notification alert, so I would be informed when her release date approached. Part of me worried that she might try something when she got out, but Grace reminded me that Deborah would be on probation for 5 years after her release, with strict conditions that would send her back to prison if she violated them. She has to know that coming after you again would be the stupidest thing she could possibly do, Grace said. The police, the courts, everyone knows who she is and what she did. She would not last a day if she tried anything. Grace was right, but I kept the security cameras running just in case. In September 2027, I received an interesting phone call from Richard Santos, the former HOA board member who had testified against Deborah. He had started a consulting business helping homeowners associations establish proper governance structures and avoid the kind of corruption that had infected Meadowbrook Hills. He wanted to know if I would be willing to speak at a conference about my experience. I am not much of a public speaker, I said. You do not have to be polished, Richard replied. You just have to tell your story. People need to understand what can happen when HOA boards go rogue. Your case is the perfect example. I thought about it and discussed it with Grace. She encouraged me to do it. Your story might help other people avoid the same nightmare, she said, and it might make HOA board members think twice before abusing their authority. So in October 2027, I found myself standing in front of a conference room full of HOA board members, property managers, and homeowners at a community association conference in Charlotte. I told them about the demand letter, the harassment, the false liens, and finally the criminal behavior that had landed Deborah Whitmore in prison. The response was overwhelming. Multiple people approached me afterward to share their own stories or ask for advice on dealing with similar situations. Several HOA board members told me that hearing my story had made them reconsider policies they had thought were reasonable but now recognized as potentially abusive. One woman, a board president from a community near Raleigh, pulled me aside and said, "We were about to implement a similar expansion plan. We have adjacent properties that we thought should be part of our HOA, and we were going to send them demand letters. After hearing what happened to you and what happened to Deborah Whitmore, I am going back to my board and recommending we abandon that plan entirely." That conversation alone made the whole presentation worthwhile. I had potentially prevented another person from going through what I experienced, and prevented another HOA board from destroying their lives through fraud and criminal behavior. As 2028 began, I received notification that Deborah Whitmore's release date had been set for March 2028. She had not earned any early release credits due to disciplinary issues in prison, so she would be serving nearly the full 3-year sentence. After release, she would begin her 5-year probation period with strict conditions including no contact with any of her victims and a prohibition on serving in any HOA leadership position. I felt tension building as the release date approached, but I also felt prepared. My security system was state-of-the-art now, with cameras covering every angle of the property. Detective Martinez had assured me that any violation of the restraining order or probation conditions would result in immediate arrest. And I had a phone full of emergency contacts, including the sheriff's department, my attorney, and even a private security company that Grace had found. March 2028 came and went without incident. Deborah was released from prison and moved to an apartment in Greensboro, more than 100 miles away from Asheville. According to her probation officer, who kept Detective Martinez informed, she was working as a cashier at a grocery store and maintaining a low profile. I wanted to feel relieved, but something nagged at me. Deborah Whitmore had been so absolutely convinced of her righteousness throughout the entire ordeal. She had never shown remorse or accepted responsibility. People like that did not usually just give up and move on. My instincts proved correct in June 2028 when Detective Martinez called with disturbing news. Deborah's probation officer had discovered that she was active on social media under a fake name, posting in HOA forums and offering advice on how to expand HOA boundaries and collect dues from non-member properties. She was literally trying to teach other people how to commit the same fraud that had sent her to prison. "We are bringing her in for a probation violation hearing," Martinez said. Using fake social media accounts was explicitly forbidden in her probation terms, and trying to coach others to commit fraud goes directly against the spirit of her rehabilitation. The hearing took place in July 2028. I did not have to testify, but I attended to watch. Deborah tried to argue that she was simply sharing her expertise about HOA management and had not realized the social media prohibition included educational posts under pseudonyms. The probation officer and prosecutor presented screenshots of her posts, which included advice on how to file liens against non-member properties, how to pressure adjacent landowners into paying dues, and even how to avoid getting caught by conducting harassment campaigns through third parties. Judge Hendricks, the same judge who had presided over the original case, was clearly disgusted. "Ms. Whitmore, you were given an opportunity to rehabilitate yourself and rejoin society. Instead, you have used that opportunity to try to train other people to commit the same crimes that destroyed multiple lives and earned you a prison sentence. Your probation is revoked. You will serve the remaining time in custody." Deborah was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs for the second time. This time, she would be in prison until 2033, serving out the full 5-year probation term behind bars. I left the courthouse feeling a strange mix of satisfaction and sadness. Satisfaction because justice was being served and Deborah could not hurt anyone else for a long time. Sadness because she had learned absolutely nothing from her experience and would probably never change. Grace was waiting for me outside the courthouse. We had driven to Charlotte together for the hearing. "Is it finally over?" she asked. "I think so," I said. "She will be locked up until 2033. By then, hopefully she will be too old and too tired to cause problems." We drove back to Asheville talking about the future rather than the past. Grace was pregnant with our first child, due in December. We were planning to build an addition to the house to create a proper nursery. Life was moving forward in good ways. The baby arrived on December 15, 2028, a healthy boy we named Benjamin Curtis Pierce. The middle name was in honor of Curtis Johnson, the farmer who had sold me the property and whose clear title had been instrumental in defeating the HOA's claims. Curtis had passed away the previous year at the age of 92, but his family had attended our wedding and stayed in touch. Holding my son on the front porch of the house I had almost lost to HOA fraud, looking out at the mountain views I had fought so hard to protect, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude, not just for the legal victories and the settlement money, but for the strength I had found to fight back against people who tried to take what was mine through intimidation and lies. Benjamin would grow up on this land, playing in the woods and helping in the garden, learning to restore old trucks in my workshop, and hopefully appreciating the value of independence and standing up for what is right. He would never have to worry about HOA violation notices or arbitrary rules about mailbox colors. He would have the freedom that I had bought with years of savings and protected through months of legal battles. In early 2029, Marcus Chen called with final closure on the entire case. Gerald Fisk's law firm had been formally dissolved after losing multiple malpractice lawsuits related to the fraudulent liens. Fisk himself had been disbarred and would never practice law again. Pinnacle Properties, the developer that had created the problematic covenants, had filed for bankruptcy after being hit with multiple lawsuits from homeowners associations they had established with flawed documents. "It is all over," Marcus said. "Every person and entity that enabled Deborah Whitmore's fraud has faced consequences. Your case literally changed how HOAs operate in North Carolina." He was right. The state had passed new HOA reform legislation in 2028, inspired in part by my case and the broader conversation about HOA abuse. The new laws required independent title searches before any liens could be filed, established a state HOA ombudsman to investigate complaints, and created criminal penalties for filing fraudulent liens or engaging in harassment campaigns against property owners. Other states were watching North Carolina's reforms and considering similar legislation. My story had been featured in national news outlets, homeowner advocacy publications, and even a podcast about property rights and HOA abuse. I had become an accidental advocate for HOA reform, which was not something I had ever planned but felt good about nonetheless. By summer 2029, life had settled into a peaceful rhythm. Benjamin was growing quickly, Grace's woodworking business was thriving, and my truck restoration work kept me busy with interesting projects. The property that had almost been stolen from me through fraud was now the foundation of a full and happy life. I still got occasional calls from people dealing with HOA disputes, usually referred by Marcus Chen's office, or by people who had heard my story through news coverage. I tried to help when I could, offering advice on documentation, explaining what had worked in my case, and sometimes just listening to people who needed to vent about their situations. One memorable call came from a man in Florida who was dealing with an HOA trying to claim his waterfront property. His situation was remarkably similar to mine, right down to the HOA president being a middle-aged woman named Brenda who had a reputation for aggressive enforcement of rules. I walked him through everything I had learned, shared contact information for property rights attorneys, and emphasized the importance of documentation. 6 months later, he called back to tell me he had won his case. The HOA's claims had been thrown out, the fraudulent lien had been removed, and Brenda was under investigation for multiple counts of filing false documents. He credited my advice with giving him the roadmap to fight back effectively. Those calls reminded me that my experience, as terrible as it had been while I was living through it, had value beyond my own situation. Every person I helped avoid HOA fraud, every board member who heard my story and reconsidered aggressive tactics, every piece of reform legislation that cited my case, represented something positive emerging from the nightmare. As 2030 arrived, 5 years after that first demand letter had turned my peaceful life upside down, I could look back with perspective. The fight had been hard. There had been moments when I wondered if it was worth the stress and expense. There had been nights when I could not sleep because I was worried about losing everything I had worked for. But I had stood my ground. I had refused to be intimidated by fraudulent claims and official-sounding threats. I had documented everything, hired good lawyers, and trusted the legal system to recognize the truth. And in the end, justice had prevailed. The criminals had gone to prison, the victims had been compensated, and reforms had been implemented to prevent future abuse. My property was mine, free and clear, with no HOA claims or clouds on the title. My family was healthy and happy. My businesses were successful. And I had the satisfaction of knowing that my fight had helped protect other people from similar fraud. Standing on my porch with a cup of coffee, watching Benjamin play in the yard while Grace worked in her woodshop, I felt completely at peace. This was exactly what I had envisioned when I bought this land back in 2015. It had taken a detour through legal battles and HOA fraud, but I had arrived at the destination I had always intended. The mountains rose in the distance, unchanged by all the human drama that had unfolded at their feet. The trees swayed in the breeze, indifferent to homeowner association disputes and property rights battles. Nature continued its eternal rhythms while human conflicts played out and resolved themselves. I took a sip of coffee and smiled. Life was good, the nightmare was over, and my land was mine now and forever with no HOA to tell me otherwise.